My name is James, and I'm a former Marine who served a tour in Afghanistan. I've experienced my fair share of intense situations, but what I encountered while camping in the Appalachian Mountains last summer truly shook me to my core. It all began when my fiancée Lana and I decided to take a break from our stressful lives and go camping in the Appalachian Mountains in June. We're both avid outdoors enthusiasts and enjoy hiking, so this seemed like the perfect getaway. We packed our gear, loaded up our truck, and set out for a serene adventure. We decided to follow a remote trail deep into the forest to maximize our seclusion and enjoy the beauty of the wilderness. The trail itself was nothing out of the ordinary, a relatively easy hike with a few steep inclines that made for a moderately challenging trek. As we hiked, we couldn't help but feel the energy of the forest around us. The sheer beauty of the Appalachian Mountains never fails to astonish, even for a veteran Marine like myself. After a few days of hiking, we found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing in the middle of the forest, with a babbling brook nearby for white noise and easy access to fresh water. We pitched our tent, started a small campfire, and settled in, proud of our progress and eager for a peaceful night's sleep. Our first indication that something was amiss came when Lana pointed out a peculiar smell in the air. It was a pungent and lingering odor, like nothing we'd ever smelled before. I tried to brush it off as the scent of a nearby animal or decomposing plant matter, but Lana was still uneasy. Always one to trust my instincts, I performed a perimeter sweep of our campsite, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Apart from some rustling leaves and the typical sounds of the forest, everything seemed to be normal. I reassured Lana, and we went to sleep. That night, however, was anything but peaceful. We were both startled awake by strange noises coming from outside our tent, shuffling footsteps and soft, guttural grunts. I reached for my flashlight and tentatively unzipped the tent flap, shining the light into the darkness. What I saw still haunts me. About 25 yards away, illuminated only by the dim beam of my flashlight, was a large humanoid figure. Even in the low light, I could see that it was covered in coarse, matted hair and moved in a peculiar hunched manner. Its eyes glinted menacingly in the darkness, fixing me with an unnerving stare. I knew something was off. This was unlike any animal I'd ever encountered or been trained to confront. My initial thought was to confront the creature, to protect Lana and our campsite. However, my Marine training kicked in, reminding me that in unfamiliar situations, sometimes the best course of action is to disengage and create distance. I quickly and quietly zipped up the tent and whispered the situation to Lana. We hastily gathered our most essential belongings, threw them into our backpacks, and made our way back towards the trail as stealthily as possible. Our hearts pounded as we left the campsite, dreading what might happen if the creature saw us leave. As we walked, the sense of being watched grew heavier, and the air seemed to become thicker with that same pungent odor. We were both on high alert, scanning our surroundings for any signs of the creature. We could feel it stalking us, never far behind, just on the periphery of our vision, and never quite maintaining a single shape. It was always shifting, blending with the trees and shadows of the forest. Our hearts pounded as we debated what to do. Should we continue hiking and risk exhausting ourselves, or try to find another spot to sleep out the night? We were exhausted, and with sunrise still hours away, we knew that neither option was desirable. Despite our bodies' screams for rest, we held on tight to our adrenaline rush to propel us further away from whatever was lurking in the darkness. We finally made the decision to find a high, rocky outcrop where we could hide and take turns sleeping while keeping watch for the creature. Climbing up, we felt a bit of ease knowing that between the two of us, we had military training and experience with mountain lions and bears. But we must admit that we both knew, deep down, that this creature was far from being anything that we had ever encountered before. We huddled close and took turns sleeping, always on edge, dreading the thought of encountering the creature again, but praying for the sunrise and our safe escape. The next morning, we made our way back to the trailhead, still shaken, constantly looking over our shoulders for any sign of the creature. As the miles passed and the morning light grew stronger, we began allowing ourselves to breathe a little easier, hoping that we had finally put some distance between us and our nocturnal nemesis. Reflecting on our experience, I cannot say for certain what we encountered in the Appalachian Mountains that night. Theories have ranged from an unknown cryptid species to escaped primates or a prankster in a costume. All we know is that we experienced something that we thought only existed in myths, legends, and horror stories, and it forever changed our perception of the wild, unknown places on this earth, where we humans are but mere visitors. And as much as my training has taught me to confront and overcome challenges, sometimes there's simply no explanation for what lies hiding in the shadows. A little about me. I'm a former Marine stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina back in 2012. During my time there, I had a special interest in wildlife and survival skills. When I wasn't on duty, I would go exploring the vast terrain that surrounds the base, including the rivers, marshes, and dense forests. Now, I want to share an experience I had that's been on my mind ever since it happened. I'm interested in hearing your opinions on what I encountered that day. It was a warm summer day, and I had just completed a 12-hour shift on base. I decided I needed some time to clear my head and enjoy the outdoors. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with some food and water, and set out on a trail that ran alongside one of the many creeks surrounding Camp Lejeune. The trail was familiar to me, as I had explored it many times before. It was a somewhat secluded area, preserved for training exercises and the occasional adventurous hiker. I made my way through the woods, appreciating everything from the way the sunlight filtered through the trees to the various sounds of animals scurrying in the underbrush. Halfway through my hike, I decided to take a break and rest by the creek. The water was shallow, and I could see the small fish darting around in the crystal-clear water. I removed my boots and socks and let my feet soak in the cool water, the small pebbles pressing against my tired soles. It was a welcome break from my long day, and along with the sounds of nature, I felt myself drifting into a state of relaxation. That's when I heard it, an unnerving, high-pitched call that I'd never encountered before. It was like a combination of a fox's shriek and a whistle. The serenity of my break was shattered, and I couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. I grew up around a variety of wildlife and have spent most of my adult life in the military. I prided myself on being able to identify most calls or sounds in the wilderness. This, however, was nothing like I had ever heard before. With a heightened sense of alertness, I scanned the surrounding area, trying to pinpoint the origin of this mysterious sound. I gripped the handle of my knife, which I had brought as a precaution, tightly in my hand. Just as I was considering getting back on the trail, I heard an alarming, thunderous noise from across the creek. It sounded like a weighty body crashing through the dense underbrush, something far larger than any deer or black bear I had encountered in this area before. As the crashing grew louder, I started to make my way back to the trail. I moved slowly but deliberately, trying not to make any sudden noises that might draw attention to myself. The unknown creature seemed to be mirroring my movements, crashing through the brush in unison with each step I took. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed or stalked by this mysterious creature. A mixture of fear and curiosity flooded my mind, urging me to continue moving and put distance between me and the unknown. Eventually, the noise ceased, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. I continued to make my way back to the trail, the adrenaline keeping my senses on high alert. I couldn't help but keep glancing behind me, searching the underbrush for any signs of movement or danger. As I reached the end of the trail, I noticed a bizarre stick formation in the direction of where I had heard the high-pitched call earlier. I couldn't help but think that whatever made those sounds earlier also created this odd formation. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize the day's events, but I couldn't come up with a logical explanation for what I had encountered. I didn't want to jump to conclusions or indulge paranoid thoughts, but the fact remained. I had experienced something utterly inexplicable, and it had left me feeling unnerved. As I made my way back to base, the question, "What do you think?" lingered in my mind. I wasn't sure what I had witnessed or encountered, and I wasn't sure I wanted to have that experience again. So, I ask you all this. What do you think I encountered that day in the woods near Camp Lejeune? Was it just my panicked imagination fueled by exhaustion, or something more mysterious lurking in those secluded woods? I'm not sure what this was, but I don't want to deal with it again. Thanks for reading my story, and I appreciate any input or thoughts you might have to share. Back in 2010, I was a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton in California, taking part in military exercises and intense jungle training. There were about 20 of us on this training exercise, and we were set to be out in the dense forests for 5 days. Most of us had been on several similar training exercises, but there were a few new recruits who had never experienced anything quite like this before. On the third day, we set up camp in a secluded area near a small creek. The forest was eerily quiet that night, and we just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We chalked it up to the exhaustion from the long days of training and the nerves of the new guys getting to us. As we settled in for the night, one of the new recruits claimed he saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at him from behind the trees. We all laughed it off as a rookie's overactive imagination, and he reluctantly went back to his bunk. But that uneasy feeling just wouldn't go away. At around midnight, something woke me up. It was hard to explain, but it felt like a presence was nearby. The air was thick with tension, and I could see that a few of the other Marines were also wide awake, their eyes scanning the surrounding area for any signs of movement. As we exchanged glances, we knew we needed to check the perimeter to ensure there were no intruders or a threat to our camp. Just as a small group of us began our search, we heard the unmistakable sound of branches snapping nearby. It seemed like the noise was coming from multiple directions, almost as though several things were circling our camp. We moved cautiously yet swiftly, trying to identify the source of the sound. As we approached the edge of the tree line, we caught sight of a dark, massive figure just beyond our flashlight beams. It was a hulking creature, standing on its hind legs with what looked like elongated arms. Its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of green as they stared directly at us. The sight sent shivers down our spines, and we couldn't move our gaze away from the menacing figure. As suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared back into the shadows, leaving us all questioning what we'd witnessed. We continued our search, finding nothing but trampled undergrowth, and more of those bone-chilling sounds of branches snapping. It felt like we were being watched, stalked even, by something we couldn't comprehend. Returning to camp, we debriefed our fellow Marines about the strange creature and the unsettling feeling still lingering around our camp. Those who were doubtful started to feel uncomfortable as well, and we all agreed that setting out a perimeter watch was our best course of action. For the remainder of the night, small teams of us took turns patrolling the area, our weapons at the ready. The sinister atmosphere kept us on edge for the entire night, and sleep was all but a luxury none of us could indulge in. As dawn broke, we packed up our camp and moved out, eager to leave the area where we'd had our chilling encounter. We couldn't help but look back over our shoulders as we trekked through the forest, unable to shake the feeling that we were still being watched. When we finally left the jungle and returned to the base, we shared our experiences among ourselves. Some dismissed it as a trick of the mind due to fatigue, while others wholeheartedly believed that we had come across something out of the ordinary. Theories range from undiscovered creatures to secret experiments gone wrong. So, what do you think? To this day, I'm not sure what it was that my fellow Marines and I encountered on that night in Camp Pendleton, but I know one thing for certain. I don't ever want to come face to face with it again. I've been a Marine for over a decade, and I've seen many strange and scary things while on active duty. However, one incident I recently experienced while visiting my family in North Carolina stands out as the most chilling and unexplainable occurrence I've ever witnessed. I spent some time off at my parents' house and decided to explore the woods behind their property. Growing up, I loved going on hikes and camping trips in the area, so I thought revisiting these old memories would bring me a sense of nostalgia. It was a slightly overcast day, and I set out on a hike around mid-afternoon, planning to make my way back before it got too dark. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed the temperature dropping and the sunlight fading earlier than expected. Despite the unfamiliar sensation of being unnerved, I pressed on, following an old deer trail further into the forest. The further I walked, the quieter it became. All I could hear were the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional breeze rustling through the trees. I eventually came across a small stream and thought it would be a good place to take a break before continuing my hike. Unexpectedly, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. It was as if I was being watched or unwanted in the area. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger. As I looked around, trying to find the source of my unease, I noticed something strange. The once meandering stream now appeared to be flowing unnaturally straight. The banks of the stream were littered with rocks that seemed to be artificially arranged in a pattern. Unable to dismiss the oddity, I decided to follow the stream in hopes of finding an explanation. The sun began to disappear behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I pushed the unnerving feeling aside and tried to focus on the beauty of the woods. However, as I continued to follow the strangely uniform course of the stream, I couldn't ignore the sensation that I was getting closer to something unknown and potentially dangerous. As dusk set in, I began to hear faint, unidentifiable sounds in the distance. It started as a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, but soon it grew louder and more distinct, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps just out of sight. I tried to rationalize the sounds. Perhaps it was a deer or some other harmless creature. But as the sounds grew closer and more deliberate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being stalked. My instincts as a Marine kicked in, and I cautiously made my way towards a large boulder for cover. Peeking out from behind the rock, I scanned the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me. But all I could see were the trees and the now rapidly darkening woods. The footsteps seemed to have stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. My heart raced as the tension in the air intensified. I knew I had to make it back home before night fell completely, and a powerful feeling of dread told me I had to leave immediately. Summoning my courage, I prepared to sprint back in the direction I had come from. Just as I was about to take off, my eyes caught a glimpse of something unnatural. There, by the edge of the stream and partially concealed behind a tree, was a tall, dark figure. My heart dropped, and I froze in fear as I realized it wasn't a person, at least not any normal human being that I've ever encountered. It was tall and thin, easily over 7 feet. Its limbs were long and unnaturally lengthened, with skin so pale it was almost translucent under the fading light. I could see veins or something like veins crawling up its arms and legs. The creature stood still, seemingly aware that I had spotted it. It emitted a faint guttural hiss, enough to make my skin crawl, and turned its gaze directly at me. Its eyes were unnaturally large and pitch black, devoid of any life or emotion. The sense of malice and danger radiating from it was palpable. As a seasoned Marine, I've been trained to handle a myriad of hostile situations, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I was paralyzed, unsure of whether to run or stay put in the name of self-preservation. This thing, there was no way it was a human or any creature I've seen, and trust me, I've seen my fair share of creatures. Suddenly the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an impenetrable darkness. Unable to move, I crouched behind the boulder, utterly terrified and unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I desperately tried to slow my breathing, fearing that the creature could hear my panic. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, but the forest remained deceptively still. I eventually mustered up the courage to move, carefully making my way back to my parents' house. With every step, I felt the lingering sensation of being watched, and I couldn't silence the persistent thoughts of twisted, unnatural limbs reaching out to grab me. When I finally arrived home, I was a complete mess. My skin had gone ice cold, and I was trembling uncontrollably. I didn't tell my family about the encounter. I knew they would think I was either lying or losing my mind. It's been weeks since the incident, and I still get chills every single time I think about that creature. I've spent countless hours researching what it could be, but I've come up empty-handed. Whatever I experienced that evening terrified me more than any enemy I've faced during my time in the service. This isn't any wartime propaganda or horror story created for entertainment. It's something out there, which is more terrifying than any other thing I've ever experienced. Rest assured, I'll never venture back into those woods again. A few years back, while I was still serving as an active-duty Marine, myself and some other members of my unit were stationed in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest for a training exercise. The dense, isolated forest was the perfect setting to test our survival and tactical skills, or so we thought at the time. Little did we know that this unforgettable experience would change our lives forever. Our unit arrived at the training site on a crisp, overcast morning. The towering evergreens enveloped us as we hiked deep into the forest. The 6 of us were eager to put our training into action. We had heard rumors that this forest was supposedly haunted, but we didn't give them much thought, and dismissed them as campfire stories meant to spook new recruits. For the first few days, the exercise went as expected. We navigated, communicated, and accomplished our objectives efficiently. The eerie silence of the forest didn't faze us, but as the days went on, that silence began to feel oppressive. It was as if the forest was watching us, just waiting for something to happen. On the 4th day, things took an unexpected turn. As we tread further into the forest, we stumbled upon a series of large footprints, unlike anything we had ever seen before. They were at least twice the size of a human foot, and seemed to have been made by a large bipedal creature. We documented the prints with photographs and measurements before continuing our patrol. Curiosity now piqued. That night, as we sat around a small fire, we couldn't help but discuss the bizarre footprints. One of our squad mates, Corporal Thompson, had heard stories about massive ape-like creatures that inhabited these remote forests. But most of us brushed it off as another baseless rumor. After all, our mission was more important than exploring local legends, right? The following days were uneventful, though we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker just out of sight, and our nights were occasionally disrupted by distant guttural calls echoing through the trees. We began to feel increasingly on edge, constantly observing our surroundings for any signs of danger. On the 7th day, we found another set of the massive footprints, this time accompanied by a pungent, musky odor wafting through the air. We found broken branches and flattened bushes consistent with a large, heavy creature pushing through the foliage. The tracks seemed fresh, as if whatever had made them was still nearby. It was during the final 2 days of our exercise that the encounter finally happened. It was dusk. As we carefully patrolled, our weapons up and senses heightened, the guttural calls grew louder and more insistent. We formed a perimeter around our campsite, visually sweeping the area for any indication of the source. Suddenly I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A large dark figure crouched behind some brush. I turned my headlight on it, only to feel my body freeze in shock. Standing before us was an enormous ape-like creature, its fur coarse and matted. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, and its broad shoulders gave it an imposing presence. Its arms, thick and powerful, hung past its knees, and its huge barrel-like chest heaved with each breath. The creature stared at us, seemingly as curious about us as we were about it. It tilted its head, its dark, intelligent eyes scanning our group. Nobody could bring themselves to speak or move, the gnawing fear in our chests holding us firmly in place. Time seemed to stand still as the creature studied us, its gaze unblinking. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl before disappearing into the thick underbrush. We could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping of branches as it retreated, fading into the depths of the forest. As soon as it was gone, we rushed back to our camp, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We packed up our gear in record time and hastily navigated back to our extraction point. When debriefed about our training exercise, we hesitantly mentioned our encounter, sharing photos of the footprints and the detailed descriptions of the creature we had seen. Although our superiors were skeptical, they could tell that we were deeply shaken by the experience. The rumors of massive, elusive creatures roaming the Pacific Northwest were well known, but rarely discussed in the military. "You saw what you saw," they told us, no further explanation given. Years have passed since that fateful encounter, but the memory still remains fresh in our minds. Some of us have since left the military, while others have moved on to different units and assignments. However, that experience has bonded us in a way that no training exercise ever could. Hey everyone. I don't usually share stories like this, but something happened a few years ago that I still can't shake. I'm curious if anyone else has had a similar experience or could provide some insight. I was on deployment as a Marine stationed off the coast of North Carolina. My buddy and I were tasked with patrolling a stretch of beach one quiet night. The moonlight provided enough visibility to navigate, but the darkness surrounding us was still pretty intense. What should have been a standard exercise in the field quickly took a bizarre turn. As we were making our way down the beach, we noticed something massive looming in the distance. As we got closer, it became clear that it wasn't some kind of vessel or debris that had washed ashore. It stood at least 8 feet tall, and its broad shoulders had an overwhelming presence. Upon seeing us, the creature suddenly let out a deafening roar and raised its arms, revealing an intimidating mass of matted fur covering its entire body. My buddy and I were completely caught off guard, and immediately became gripped by fear. Our training had prepared us for various threats, but not something like this. We hightailed it back to our base camp, hearts pounding, unable to comprehend what we had just witnessed. We mustered the courage to report the incident to our commanding officer, but we were met with skepticism and disbelief. There's more to the story, because 2 days later we were in the same place with one of our higher-ups who was curious about our encounter. We had secured better equipment this time around, hoping we'd be able to identify and possibly capture whatever it was that had frightened us so much before. As we carefully trekked through the same stretch of beach, the eerie silence of the night surrounded us. That's when we heard it again, a guttural roar. It sounded even closer this time. Our higher-up raised his weapon, prepared for the worst, while my buddy and I fought the urge to flee. We spotted the creature in the darkness, standing at the edge of the dunes not too far from us. It was as tall and menacing as before, and it appeared to be angry. As the three of us cautiously approached the creature, grasping our weapons tightly, it suddenly began hurling large rocks towards us. The rocks pummeled the beach at a velocity that would have been impossible for a human to achieve. We were astonished by the display of strength and gave chase, determined to gather evidence of this terrifying beast. We searched the area where the creature had last been seen and discovered a makeshift den hidden within a thicket on the dunes. Inside, we found a collection of seaweed and foliage that formed what appeared to be a bed. However, like before, we couldn't find any tangible evidence such as hair or footprints to support our claims. Our supervisors had pulled us aside and told us very sternly to never speak of this incident again, as it would only cause panic and wild speculation within our unit. My buddy and I were left feeling frustrated, as we knew what we saw was real and could have been a potential threat. We maintained our silence, but to this day, the memory of that encounter lingers with us. I came across a few vague stories of local fishermen having odd encounters with large, hairy creatures on the beaches, accompanied by a strong and unsettling odor. However, nothing concrete has ever come to light. So here I am, sharing our story to you all in hopes that someone might have an explanation or have experienced something similar. I'm not looking to gain attention or stir up trouble. I just want to know the truth. What did my buddy and I see that night, and why has it remained a secret all these years? Any input or theories are welcome. But I implore you, please take this seriously. That creature was real, and the fear it invoked in me and my fellow Marine was genuine. The unknown can be frightening, but perhaps by sharing our encounters, we can bring some clarity and understanding. I'm a former Marine, and one thing I've always enjoyed doing since my time in the service is taking long hikes. A few years ago, I had the strange encounter I'm about to share with you. It happened in a remote mountain area in the Pacific Northwest, far from civilization. It was around 9 p.m. when I started my hike. The sky was overcast and the trail seemed eerily quiet, but I was determined to make my way up to a lookout point I knew was about a 2-hour hike in. I had my trusty flashlight and a small pocket knife for protection, just in case. About half an hour into my walk, I heard a noise not too far off the trail. It sounded like a large animal moving through the brush, heavy enough to snap branches as they passed. I decided it would be best to keep moving, not wanting to have any unwanted encounters with wildlife. As I continued on, I could still hear whatever it was moving alongside me, never more than 30 yards away at any point. The crunching of leaves under its feet, and the heavy breathing as it matched my pace made my skin crawl. With each passing minute, my heart raced faster, and I began to regret my decision to hike by myself at night. As I reached a fork in the trail, the noise seemed to grow louder somehow, as if the creature was closing in. Gripping my pocket knife tightly, I tried to stay calm, reminding myself of my training back in the Marines. I decided to stop moving for a moment and just listen. Perhaps I could identify what I was dealing with. As I stood motionless, everything went silent. The crunching in the underbrush, the snapping of branches, even the creature's heavy breathing. And then, without warning, the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard pierced the silent night air. The strange creature, whatever it was, let out a horrifying call that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I'd had enough. I took off running, making my way back to my vehicle as quickly as I could without losing my footing on the rough trail. The entire way, I could still hear the creature following along, never too far behind. As I finally reached my truck, I fumbled to unlock the door and jumped in, slamming it shut behind me. As my heart pounded, I started the engine and drove away, never once looking back. Turns out that later that same night, another hiker reported seeing a large bipedal creature with dark hair crossing the same mountain trail I had been on. The description immediately brought to mind folklore legends of Bigfoot, but I tried to brush it off as just a coincidence. Since that night, I've moved away from the Pacific Northwest and haven't dared to go on a solo hike at night again. I've only shared this story with a few close friends, as I'm aware of the skepticism surrounding such encounters. But years later, and now far from those trailheads, I'm still haunted by that chilling, unexplained scream and the eerie feeling of being stalked by something unknown. I'm not saying it was definitely a Bigfoot I encountered, but I know what I lived through was real, and nothing like anything I encountered during my time as a Marine. So, for those of you who enjoy the outdoors, remember to always be aware of your surroundings, and maybe, just maybe, leave the night hikes to the braver ones among us. I used to be a Marine, and even now I continue to be an avid hunter and lover of wildlife. Living in a rural town in Arkansas, I often take long drives in the countryside to observe and study the animals. Last month, while driving along a quiet country road near the Black River, I witnessed something that left me shocked and fascinated. Around 3 miles from my house, on this isolated road called Blackberry Lane, I spotted a group of white-tailed deer grazing in the grassy fields near some woodland. There were 4 of them, 2 large bucks and 2 smaller does. Intrigued by their presence, I stopped my truck and decided to wait and observe their behavior. As I was watching the deer from my truck window, I saw something lurking in the woods on the other side of the field. It was crouched behind a big oak tree, and initially, I thought it might be another deer. But as I continued to observe, I noticed that it was a 2-legged creature rather than a 4-legged one. This creature seemed to be watching the group of deer, as if it was stalking them. The creature looked like it could be over 7 feet tall when standing upright. It had broad shoulders, a slim waist, and thick, muscular legs. It appeared to have hands with opposable thumbs, which were gripping the tree for balance. The face of the creature looked somewhat canine, with a protruding muzzle. Its body was covered in dark brown fur, which blended well with the surrounding forest. As I continued my observation, the deer seemed to be oblivious to the presence of this creature. However, the wind blew in my direction and probably carried my scent towards the deer. Realizing there might be a threat, the deer bolted and dispersed quickly into the woods. Just then, the creature turned its attention towards me. It stared at me for a while, and I couldn't help but feel as if it was blaming me for losing its potential meal. We locked eyes for a few moments, and I could see the intelligence and curiosity in its gaze. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, and fear washed over me. Somehow my marine instincts kicked in, urging me to put some distance between myself and this mysterious being. So, I quickly hit the gas pedal and drove off, leaving the creature behind. I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter, and decided to return to the location early the next morning to search for any evidence or tracks left behind by the creature. I wanted to understand what I had seen. With daylight on my side, I walked over to the oak tree where I had seen the creature lurking the previous day. The ground around the tree was mostly dry, compacted dirt, with only a few patches of snow still remaining. It wasn't the best ground for finding clear tracks, but after an extensive search, I found something that caught my attention. There were several prints on the hard-packed ground, each about 6-7 inches in length. They looked like canine tracks, but with 4 toe-like protrusions, which seemed unusual to me. I'm no wildlife expert, but as a hunter and a former Marine, I've seen my fair share of animal tracks, and these were definitely something different. The creature I'd seen seemed to be a blend of both human and an unknown species, something truly extraordinary. I actually returned that evening to the same spot with one of my buddies, Tony, to see if we could encounter the creature again. We sat in my truck, parked near the oak tree, waiting and keeping watch. Tony, who had also spent time in the service, was initially skeptical when I told him about my experience. But as we sat in the fading evening light, his skepticism gave way to anticipation. He gradually understood the gravity and fear that I had felt during my encounter. As twilight turned into darkness, we started hearing noises from the woods. It wasn't unusual, since various nocturnal animals inhabit the area. However, the noises seemed louder and more frequent than normal. Tony and I exchanged glances, our tension rising with each snap of a twig, rustle of leaves, or distorted animal call. Suddenly, we saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes appear in the woods, close to where the deer had been grazing the previous day. It took my breath away, but I also felt a familiar adrenaline surge, the kind that my Marine training had instilled within me. The creature cautiously stepped out of the woods, walking confidently on 2 legs, much like it did the previous day. It had a predatory, menacing presence that sent shivers down my spine. Tony, sitting in the passenger seat, turned to me, his eyes wide with awe and curiosity. Instead of retreating, like it did the day before, the creature ambled out into the open field, stopping about 50 yards from where we were parked. It just stood there, staring at us, almost as if challenging us. I gripped the wheel tightly and whispered to Tony, "This is it. This is what I saw." We sat there in silence for several minutes, observing the creature as it observed us. Suddenly, it let out a low, guttural howl that seemed to echo through the valley. Goosebumps covered my entire body, and even Tony, who was a fearless guy, seemed shaken by the sound. The howl was the last straw for us. I started my truck and reversed out of there. Tony and I headed back to my house and didn't talk much on the drive home. It was clear that what we had seen was not any type of species known to us. As we reached the safety of our town, we had to make a decision. Neither of us was overly imaginative, but we both knew what we had witnessed could not be explained away easily. We decided to keep our encounter to ourselves, fearing the ridicule and disbelief of our friends and neighbors. Every once in a while, Tony and I still talk about that mysterious creature, the Arkansas dogman, as we've come to call it. It opened our eyes to the unknown realms hidden in our familiar world, leaving us humbled and forever curious about the nature of our planet and its inhabitants. My son and I were driving south on the 130 highway just outside of Tucson, Arizona. He was in the passenger seat, and I was driving my pickup truck. The sky was cloudy, but there was no rain. It was just around sunset, and there was still enough light to see everything clearly. As a former Marine, I've had plenty of experience in the outdoors, and have seen my fair share of wildlife. But nothing could have prepared me for what we saw that day. Highway 130 is a 2-lane road through the desert, and there wasn't much traffic at that time. We were driving at a leisurely pace, enjoying the unique beauty of the vivid desert landscape. Suddenly, I saw movement up ahead on the right side of the road. An animal, larger than anything I'd seen before, dashed across the road from right to left, disappearing into the brush on the left side of the highway. I slowed the truck down slightly, trying to figure out what this creature was as it moved incredibly fast. As my eyes were still focused on the left side of the road, I caught a glimpse of the animal re-emerging from the brush, now running parallel to our truck about 25 feet away. It was on all fours, moving with incredible speed and grace, easily matching our pace of around 35 miles per hour. I was stunned, never having seen an animal move like this before. The creature appeared to be about 3.5 feet tall as it ran on all fours, with a muscular and thick build. It was covered in short, dark brown hair about 2 inches in length, with a slightly longer mane around its neck and shoulders. It didn't resemble any animal I had seen in my time in the desert or during my stint as a Marine deployed in various locations. My eyes were darting between the road and the creature, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing. I couldn't help but think of the animals we had encountered overseas during my time in the Marines, but none fit this description. The creature's face was obscured by the speed at which it was moving, and all I could make out was a blur with dark, intense eyes. My son, alerted by my reaction, began watching the creature as well. We exchanged a glance, both trying to make sense of what we were seeing. As the creature moved away from the road and back into the desert brush, we lost sight of it completely. The encounter had lasted around 10-15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We drove the rest of the way to our destination in silence, both of us processing what we had just witnessed. When we finally spoke about it later that night, we couldn't come up with any rational explanation for what we had seen. Neither of us had ever seen an animal like that before, and as a former Marine, I was used to recognizing all types of common wildlife. I first heard about El Chupacabra on the news, and its description closely matched what we had seen. I couldn't help but think about that encounter near Tucson, wondering if we had truly seen something extraordinary. I have shared this story with a few of my fellow Marines and friends, but I am usually met with skepticism. Understandably so, as it's not every day that you encounter an unknown animal in the desert. However, I know for a fact my son and I witnessed something unusual that day, something that neither of us have ever been able to forget. Although I can't provide any concrete evidence or photographs of the creature, I can only share my experience as honestly as possible. As a former Marine, my instincts and intuition have served me well in the past, and on that day near Tucson, we saw something that I cannot attribute to any known animal in this world. Fast forward to 2004 when my wife and I at the time were camping in the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix. It was early spring and a clear evening, with the sun just starting its descent towards the horizon. We had set up camp near a secluded stream, miles away from any roads or civilization. As seasoned campers, my wife and I were well prepared for the trip with ample food, water, and emergency supplies. As the sky began to darken, we settled in around the campfire, enjoying the calm serenity of nature. Everything was peaceful until we heard a rustling in the brush nearby. My immediate thought was of the mysterious creature my son and I had witnessed years before. As a former Marine, I'm not one to be easily rattled, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously scanned the area while my wife stood beside me. We couldn't see anything unusual, and the noise had stopped. Thinking it must have been just a small animal, we went back to the warmth of the fire and resumed our conversation. Moments later, we heard the sound again, this time louder and closer. I could sense fear creeping up in both of us as we exchanged worried looks. I stood up, ready to protect my wife, even though I had no idea what we were up against. The noise continued, growing louder and more frantic. I strained my eyes to see through the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of the animal responsible for the noise. That's when we saw it, the same type of creature my son and I had seen years earlier. It slowly emerged from the brush on all fours, not more than 20 feet from our campsite. This time I could see its face, an elongated snout and fierce, gleaming eyes locked onto ours. My heart raced, and I grabbed my wife's hand, ready to head for the safety of our truck. But as quickly as it had appeared, the creature retreated back into the brush, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't have any further encounters that night, but we both agreed to cut our camping trip short and head back home the following morning. I've shared this story with other former Marines and friends, but am often met with the same skepticism as before. Understandably so, as it's beyond ordinary to encounter such a creature not once but twice in the desert. What do you think? I recently moved out of my apartment near the forest in Brandon, Vermont. Over the past few months, I've encountered some strange experiences that are far from anything I'd experienced in my past as a Marine. I've seen a large, dark, bipedal figure disappear into the woods on foggy nights, and I've heard heavy footsteps that didn't seem like anything a four-legged animal could make. Late one evening in March, I stumbled upon a peculiar sound outside my window, something hitting tree trunks rhythmically. As a former Marine, I've learned to stay alert in unfamiliar situations, so I cautiously approached the window to investigate. To my bewilderment, firewood from the nearby pile seemed to be thrown against the trees by some invisible force. Then, it happened. On April 5th, as I was preparing to move out of the apartment. There was a low, guttural howl that echoed through the night, a sound so unnatural and alien that I stopped what I was doing and grabbed my trusted pistol. I couldn't shake off the primal fear that clawed at me, and I made sure to secure all entry points before resuming work. Now, normally when I hike with my camping gear, I carry a Glock 17 for protection from wildlife, but I felt the need to have it in my hand this time. It was around 7 p.m., and being that it was early April, the sun had just set. My friend Jim, who lived nearby and knew the area well, was there to help me pack up. We decided to take a short break and stand outside to clear our heads. As we stood outside, the low, guttural howl came again, this time closer to the edge of the forest. Jim looked concerned, which only heightened my anxiety. He mentioned that wild animals haunt the woods at night, but he'd never heard anything like that before. With an inexplicable feeling of dread building up, I insisted we go and try to identify what was making the sound. Armed and cautious, we moved towards the edge of the forest with our flashlights illuminating the way. The sound seemed to be coming from deep within the thick foliage, and we hesitated, wondering if entering would be the smartest decision. Before we could decide, we noticed something that would forever stick with us. Large, deep scratches were carved into several trees about 7 feet off the ground. The markings were definitely not consistent with anything Jim had ever seen or heard about in his years living around these woods. Now it was during that same evening when we decided to follow those scratches, hoping to find out what was causing these mysterious events. As we ventured deeper into the forest, we stumbled upon footprints, larger than any wild animal that resides in the area. The tracks were different. They appeared bipedal, like a person, but with toes that seemed widened and elongated. Jim and I exchanged concerned glances, but our curiosity got the best of us. We continued on following the tracks and discovered a clearing about a mile in. The underbrush had been trampled, and dark, coarse hairs were tangled in the branches of the nearby bushes. It felt like we were entering someone's territory, and an unwelcome sensation washed over us. At that moment, we heard branches snap, and the sound came from several yards away on the other side of the clearing. It was relatively dark by now, and our flashlights barely managed to pierce the darkness. There, in the shadows, a massive silhouette loomed, easily 7 feet tall and emitting a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down our spines. Without enough time to analyze the creature, instinct took over. We backed off slowly, maintaining eye contact with the silhouette before turning and sprinting out of the forest. As adrenaline and fear pushed us through the dense wilderness, we felt the ominous presence of the unknown being close behind. We began to hear this low vibration sound, similar to cicadas, but it sounded way off. Instantly, I could feel my gut screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. We ran until we reached the safety of my apartment, where we slammed the door shut and listened intently for any signs of pursuit. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, but there was only silence. Jim and I spent the rest of the night recounting our experience, trying to piece together a plausible explanation for what we had witnessed. Could it be some undiscovered large mammal, or a product of our overactive imaginations? We couldn't deny the evidence, the tree scratches, the footprints, and the terrifying silhouette that loomed in the darkness. I moved out of the apartment near the forest as soon as I could. The events that unfolded were enough to make me turn my back on the life I had built there. Jim and I continue to discuss the encounter, but we've never gone back to that area. My experiences with an unknown creature began in June 2012. At that time, I had recently retired from the Marines, and I was staying at my family's remote cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. The cabin was surrounded by thick forests, and there were no other houses nearby. It was a perfect place for me to relax, unwind, and reconnect with nature after years of service. One evening around 7 p.m., as I was chopping wood outside, I heard a strange sound coming from the forest. It was like a low growl mixed with a guttural grunt. I'm no stranger to wildlife, but this was something I had never heard before. I stopped what I was doing and tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound. My best guess was that it was coming from the dense woods about 50 yards to the west of the cabin. As I peered into the forest, I saw a large, shadowy figure emerge from behind the trees. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair and stood easily 7 feet tall. The creature walked upright, kind of like a human, but with a hulking, lumbering gait that seemed unnatural. It didn't notice me, and I decided it was best to stay quiet and observe from behind a large oak tree. Over the next few days, I caught glimpses of the unidentified creature several times as it roamed the woods in the evening. A few times, I even heard it let out that eerie, guttural sound. Each time, it seemed as if the creature was just passing by, rather than showing any signs of aggression or curiosity about my presence. About a week after I first saw the creature, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise outside the cabin. It sounded like somebody, or something, was rummaging through the trash cans at the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped outside to see what was going on. As I shone my light on the trash cans, I saw the creature standing there amid the strewn garbage. It must have been drawn to the smell of food. The light from my flashlight seemed to startle it, and it looked directly at me for the first time. Its eyes glowed a pale yellow, and its expression seemed more curious than threatening. It was a surreal tableau. Me, a former Marine, standing face to face with a creature I couldn't explain. Before I could process the situation further, the creature turned and darted back into the forest. The speed with which it moved was astonishing. I was left standing there. I heard a loud crashing sound to my immediate left, but when I turned to look, whatever had made the noise had already disappeared into the darkness. In the following weeks, I continued to catch glimpses of the creature. It never approached me, nor did it ever act aggressively or threateningly. Instead, it watched me from a distance, always disappearing quickly when it knew I had spotted it. I began to feel a strange connection to this elusive creature. It was as if we were both outsiders in our own ways, just trying to find our place in the world. One day, as I was hiking deeper into the forest than I had ever gone before, I discovered a vast cave on the side of a hill. Curiosity piqued. I decided to explore it. As I entered the cave, a musty, earthy scent filled the air. Carefully making my way further in, I saw what looked like large nests made from branches, leaves, and other forest debris. I quickly realized that this cave was likely the creature's home. Within 2 days' time, I decided to set up a trail camera outside the cave entrance, hoping to capture footage of the creature coming and going. The following morning, I eagerly checked the trail camera. To my amazement, there were several images of the creature entering and leaving the cave. However, I also noticed something else. The creature didn't seem to be alone. In one of the images, I could see two smaller, similar-looking creatures following it into the cave. It appeared to have a family. This discovery completely changed my perspective on the creature. I felt a sense of responsibility to protect their privacy and ensure their safety. I knew this wasn't something I could share with the world without risking harm to these beings. For the remainder of my time at the cabin, I carried on with my life, but always with a newfound respect for the creatures and their home. I never trespassed on their cave again, and I tried to give them space when we encountered each other in the woods. I understand you probably won't believe my experience, and that's okay. I'm just getting this out there so that way the others who have had similar experiences can feel validated. I had just rounded the 2-year mark of my service in the Marines, and I was granted a short leave. A group of friends and I decided to use this time to enjoy the Alaskan wilderness. We'd been planning a camping trip in a more remote, pristine location, and thought this would be the perfect opportunity to escape the confines of our base and unwind. My friends and I were no strangers to the outdoors, but none of us had ever visited Alaska before. We researched the best spots to go, and decided on a dense forest area in northern Alaska, far from any towns or other disturbances. As April approached, we gathered our gear and supplies and eagerly anticipated the adventure ahead of us. Finally, our leave started, and we began our journey into the Alaskan wilderness. After several days of driving, we reached the remote location that was to be the site of our camp for the next week or so. We set up our tents, dug a fire pit, and designated a latrine area a safe distance away. The days went by as we hiked in the woods, fished in the nearby streams, and laughed around nightly campfires. It was everything we had hoped for, and I relished the freedom and serenity the wilderness offered. On the evening of our 4th day, the weather took a turn for the worse. A thick fog rolled in, obscuring visibility beyond a few feet. This made hiking particularly challenging, as our sense of direction was completely disoriented. Despite our training in navigation and survival, my friends and I found ourselves lost in the encompassing mist. Slowly and carefully, we made our way through the fog in hopes of finding our way back to the camp. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small clearing with a dense tree line on the opposite side. As we broke for a moment to assess our bearings, a faint but distinct murmuring emanated from the trees. Startled by the sudden sound, we huddling together, each person scanning the tree line for its source. The noise grew louder, and we realized it sounded like some form of low, guttural speech. The closest thing I could compare it to was the singing of incantations or chanting during some sort of tribal ritual. The utterances were both captivating and frightening, but were interspersed with the occasional animal-like growl. As we stared into the foggy darkness, our eyes eventually discerned a tall, dark figure near the trees that seemed to be swaying slightly, as if it was just barely affected by gravity. Slowly, a sense of terror washed over us. Chills ran down my spine, my hair stood on end, and my stomach churned as I tried to comprehend the reality of this situation. "What do you think?" I whispered to one of my closest friends as we silently studied the figure. He could only shrug, his face a mixture of fear and fascination. "We need to get out of here, now," was all he could muster. As we cautiously retreated, I couldn't help but glance back at the enigmatic figure. It had seemingly vanished into the fog, but the eerie sounds persisted. With dread tightening around my chest, my friends and I moved in unison, trying to be as quiet and unnoticeable as possible. To our relief, we eventually found our way back to our camp. None of us slept that night. Instead, we took turns keeping watch, feeling secure only within the perimeters of our familiar tents and campfire. The next morning, the fog had lifted, and after a brief discussion, we unanimously decided to pack up camp and leave immediately. The sense of dread and unease was palpable, not one of us willing to spend another night in that remote location. As we left the forest and began to put distance between us and the mysterious clearing, I pondered the unwelcome encounter. I couldn't shake the notion that we had stumbled upon something otherworldly, a phenomenon far beyond any rational explanation. I am still not sure what we encountered that night, but I know I don't want to experience it again. It was something that shook us all to our core and made us appreciate the safety and predictability of our lives. Thank you for taking the time to read my story.